We're ready for our next keynote. Thank you, everyone. It's a real privilege for us to invite Carlene back to TBAP. Carlene spoke at our September staff conference and created so much excitement around the work that she was doing and so much interest that we thought she would be a great keynote speaker to invite back to share with you. I'm sure Carlene will kind of explain her work and what she does, but Carlene is the head of Misunderstood, which is a partnership that works particularly around youth justice, gender, CSE, violence, gangs interventions, and all of these things are all issues that we know we're working with on a day-to-day basis. Carlene is also a research fellow at the University of Bedfordshire, and she's also a Guardian columnist as well, so she brings some absolute expertise, but also some real understanding and passion for young people and to improve their life chances. So I'd like to introduce Carlene to you, and she will take questions at the end if anybody would like to at the end. So thank you, Carlene.
Okay, good morning everyone. Can everyone hear me okay at the back? This mic go. Okay, great. As was already said, I'm a research fellow at the University of Bedfordshire, based in their international centre with about 22 other academics who all research sexual exploitation, abuse and trafficking, and work alongside practitioners and young people to generate knowledge that will kind of advance local practice and national policy. And what I want to do with you today is to share the evidence that's coming out of the International Centre in relation to safeguarding young people from exploitation and abuse, but with particular consideration for what the research is telling us and the implications of that for education and educational settings. So there are a few things I want to try to cover. The first is to give you a very brief kind of overview, I guess, of the research into exploitation and abuse and the contextual nature of it, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a moment. Then kind of set the scene, I guess, in terms of where we've been nationally when it comes to developing a response to exploitation and abuse, and where we need to go with our response and where practice needs to develop, before thinking about the implications of that for the work that takes place in education, and to share with you some promising practice about that direction of travel. I do want to leave time for questions, so if someone could give me a 5-minute wave, that would be really helpful. So, contextual nature of exploitation and abuse. One of the things that's really interested me about research into sexual exploitation and other forms of exploitation and violence that young people experience over the past few years is that it's increasingly pointing to the particular environments which will aggravate or protect against the likelihood of a young person being exploited or abused, or indeed them exploiting or abusing others. What we've got quite used to over the past 10 years, thanks to a kind of flurry of different risk assessment toolkits, is approaches that seek to assess risk based on the individual characteristics of any given young person. How many times are they going missing from home? Do they have an offending record? Are they excluded from school? Are they male? Are they female? How old are they? Are they looked after? And in a bid to try to score the risk that they will end up in an abusive relationship, or they will end up abusing someone else or being exploited by adults. And there is much merit to that work. However, there are also limitations. And one of those key limitations is that it's very difficult to assess the risk that a child will be exploited or abuse someone else unless we have a clear understanding of the context in which that's likely to happen. A child could have 25 characteristics that we would consider would make them vulnerable to sexual exploitation, but those characteristics will not mean they will be sexually exploited unless they encounter someone who wants to exploit them, and that person is in a situation where they can freely exploit that child. So just being looked after and walking around doesn't mean that you're just automatically going to start being exploited. There has to be a situation that enables that to happen. And it's the same with young people who go on to exploit and abuse others. Now, the research is increasingly telling us a lot about what those environments are, and one of our biggest challenges, which is what I'll talk about for the bulk of this speech this morning, is how we turn that knowledge about those contexts into a practical response on the ground, how we move from solely working with individuals to working with the context in which those individuals are made vulnerable to abuse. To give you a little bit of an insight into what the research tells us about those contexts, much of which won't probably be surprising to many of you who work with young people, The first is that young people who are exposed to domestic abuse at home, routinely coming up in the research as being vulnerable to all forms of exploitation and abuse and to perpetrating it themselves, not because of a theory of intergenerational violence necessarily, and a lot of that has been questioned by academics and the stigma that comes with that on young people, that if you've lived in a violent home you're going to end up being violent yourself. That's not why we're really seeing this in the research. It's more that if a young person's home is not protective and safe, they won't want to be there. A lot of children run from homes where there's domestic abuse. Putting them on the street late at night, for example, or overnight, sofa surfing, having high levels of anxiety, struggling to feel accepted or belonging to a place of safety, and all of those things can create vulnerabilities that other people will exploit if they want to abuse them, and can also set up poor models for what a healthy relationship looks like. There are additional concerns for young men who were exposed to domestic abuse, because in most local authorities they won't be able to access refuge provision with their mothers once they turn the age of 14, and sometimes once they turn the age of 10, whereas young women can enter refuge provision with their mothers up to any age. So there are additional vulnerabilities for young men, and anecdotal concerns that women will stay in violent relationships if they have sons because they know they can't take their sons with them into refuge provision. So there's a range of complexities there at play, and the limited response to young people who are exposed to domestic abuse is an ongoing concern of mine. I've done a number of case reviews over the past 3 years, and I'm tired of the amount of times I've seen that a young person was exposed to very serious levels of domestic abuse in infancy and early childhood, and none of that was actually addressed. And an assumption that if the abusive parent is no longer in the household, that that child is safe, has kind of led the intervention rather than thinking about the impact that that may have had on that young person's emotional well-being. We also know that experiences of neglect in the home can create a vulnerability that other people want to exploit in terms of sexual exploitation, whether that's economic neglect through poverty, or whether that's emotional neglect and the need to form an attachment elsewhere. But it's actually the environments outside of the home that are particularly influential for young people as they move through adolescence. And this is one of the key challenges that we face in building a child protection response to an issue that's largely extra-familial. Our child protection response has developed about abuse and violence within homes, within families. That's how we work with child protection. When we start to recognise that the risk actually sits in the park, or at the bus stop, or in the school, or in the peer group, or in the youth club, simply intervening with a child's family does very little to actually reduce the risk that they are exposed to on a daily basis. Now, young people's peer groups become pivotal in this. We know that young people are highly influenced by their friends. That is what we accept as part of the developmental process of adolescence in the UK. It's also quite apparent in countries like Australia and the US. Less so actually in countries like France and Germany, but that's a whole other kind of presentation on peer group dynamic that I haven't got time to go into. But in the UK, we kind of take it as a given that most young people will be highly influenced by their peers during adolescence, and most parents will battle with that in terms of the types of shoes their young person demands that they have to be allowed to wear, or the type of music that they must listen to, or concerts that they have to go to because this is what their friends say is in, and the fact that their parents don't particularly approve is neither here nor there. And actually, if their parents did like the shoes they were wearing or the music they were listening to, they'd probably be quite concerned about that, because there's something about establishing yourself as an individual, establishing your own identity, and a lot of that happens through peer relationships. And what we see is young people move into adulthood and they tend to go back to the familial norms they were raised with when in their younger years, mixed in with some of those peer influences that they experienced during adolescence, and they go on to have their own families or develop their own careers, and everything's fine. For young people whose friendship groups are ones in which violence or aggression or harmful attitudes are part of the course, the influence of peers becomes more problematic. We know that young men who are in violent or aggressive peer groups are more likely to abuse their partners than young men who are in violent or abusive households. We also know that young people are far more likely to sexually offend in a group than they are on their own, and the older they get, the less likely they are to sexually offend in a group, and the more likely they are to sexually offend alone. So it's quite rare to find a group of 60-year-olds committing sexual offences together. You might find them, but it's quite rare that that happens. It's also quite rare to find a 14-year-old committing a sexual offence on their own. You do find them, and they tend to have a particular profile. They tend to be very socially isolated young people, often with a history of trauma or extreme victimisation, and they often sexually harm much younger children in private dwellings. What we're seeing, particularly in London, but not exclusively, are groups of 14 to 15-year-olds sexually harming similar age young people, and when they're on their own, most of those young people are not committing sexual offences. They're doing it as part of their group. And there will be individuals in those groups who are leading and who are more troubled and who are committing harmful behaviours on their own as well. But the bulk of those followers would only be doing that when they're with those groups. And so peer groups then become very difficult when we try to do an individual intervention for any one child in that particular friendship group, because the group norm not only outweighs parental influence, but also outweighs the influence of most practitioners. And so thinking about that, flipping that on its head and saying, well, if peer groups are so influential, how can they be part of the response to this issue? How can they be a positive influence? And we do see young people trying to act as positive bystanders and intervene and seek help and support when they have concerns about their friends. We really need to think more carefully about that, given that we know peer influence is such a strong factor for young people. Given the influence of peers, schools also become critical. They're the environments where young people form many of these friendships. If educational establishment is one that enables children to form healthy and safe friendships, nurtures those bonds, encourages them and finds space for them, then it can actually protect children against what they may have been exposed to at home, and they have an opportunity to engage in those friendships and build those attachments and relationships. If a school environment is one in which young people are exposed to sexual harassment and sexual bullying, we know that there's currently a government parliamentary inquiry into sexual violence in schools. Between 30 and 70% of young women across different surveys have reported unwanted sexual touching in school corridors and an inappropriate response to sexual harassment as banter. These types of approaches will mean that the school environment becomes one that facilitates rather than challenges the norms that sit underneath exploitation and abuse. We also know that young people can be recruited into exploitative networks, whether it's for the purposes of robbery and drugs transportation or for the purposes of sexual violence through their connections at school. And therefore an awareness of the risks external to the school environment that are being brought into a school environment and creating risks for children as they leave again is very much one that's important. And so really these lines in an ideal world would be dotted, because obviously what's happening in the neighbourhood gets brought into school, what's happening at home gets brought into school, but what's happening at school gets brought back out as well. And what we see when young people are exposed to bullying at school, for example, the breakdown in family relationships that happen at home when parents are struggling to understand a change in their child's behaviour. So these environments are very much impacting on one another, as is the neighbourhood, as I've already mentioned, and young people's exposure to crime and violence on the streets is really critical to understanding this issue. If their experience of their local neighbourhood is one in which they do not feel safe, where they need to seek the protection of others to keep them safe, we create not only a normalisation of violence, but a distrust in professionals to keep you safe from harm. Just under 450,000 violent incidents of crime were experienced by young people in 2013, the majority of which were perpetrated by other young people experiencing things such as robbery, bike theft, mobile phone theft. These incidents, which sometimes feel quite small to us, can be very significant in setting up what they feel they need to do or not do just to make the journey to and from school safely, and can enable people who want to exploit children to step in and say, I'm the one that can keep you safe when they notice these issues escalating. We also know that sexual exploitation generally happens in public spaces, parks, disused garages, disused houses, takeaway shops, off licenses, high streets, bus terminuses, places where young people hang out, and increasingly so, they're not places of safety because we're losing a lot of those provisions. And so we're seeing young people make extra familial settings for them to socialise in, but those settings are not always ones in which they are safe. So it's very much important to think about when we're talking about exploitation and abuse, not just thinking about the behaviours, which are very disturbing and concerning and harmful to a child, and not just thinking about the individual characteristics of those children, but the environments in which that abuse occurs and the responsibility of all professionals, regardless of their sector of employment, to make a contribution to changing the dynamics of the context in which exploitation and abuse can manifest. The other challenge that we're increasingly seeing being presented in terms of how we understand this issue is the multitude of titles and headings that it's called. I've talked about safeguarding children from exploitation and abuse, but sat within that are a range of issues such as going missing, displaying harmful sexual behaviour, being sexually exploited, being involved in serious youth violence, experiencing relationship abuse, experiencing radicalisation. I'm sure there'll be another one that's a government priority in 6 months' time, and everyone will need to have a response to that as well. Ultimately, they all sit under a banner of exploitation, of vulnerability, and what we need to be doing is thinking about how we move beyond these siloed issues to a holistic response to exploitation and abuse and the context in which these things manifest. So in terms of where we've been at responding to the issue thus far, predominantly our responses look something like this. One-to-one intervention for young people who have been exploited, and sometimes group-based intervention, so lots of referrals into specialist services, and voluntary sector services in particular leading the way in providing this type of support for young people over 2 decades now. The use of relocation, whether that's managed moves across schools, exclusion and then new placement into another school, or relocated out of local authorities into different local authorities, placed into care, all sorts of different types of relocation, including securing children into custody on welfare grounds for up to 6 months at a time to get them out of environments where they are being abused or where they are abusing others. Child and family assessment through child protection frameworks to get a grip on what is going wrong with this child and what is going wrong with the parenting of that child that means that that child is being exposed to violence and abuse. Investigation, once a child makes a disclosure of exploitation, and sometimes a prosecution. And as I've said, lots of strategies and action plans and assessment tools and referral pathways and different multi-agency meetings for all the different issues that were on that previous slide. So most areas will have a sexual exploitation strategy, a sexual exploitation strategic group, a sexual exploitation operational group, an assessment tool, a specialist service to refer to. That same local authority will have all of those things for youth violence, and they'll have all of those things again for radicalisation, and so on and so forth. And that's generally the strategic setup under which the one-to-one support, relocation and child and family assessment and sometimes investigation has sat. There are some benefits to what we have done. I don't want to dismiss it. A lot of the work I've done over the past 10 years has promoted much of this, but it only takes us so far. There's a lot to think about in terms of where we go next, given that that's what we're doing. That doesn't come close to touching risk within friendship groups, risk within schools, risk on the street. It doesn't come close. What it does is acknowledges context by relocation. If you didn't think the risk was contextual, you'd never take a child out of the context. So it acknowledges that the problem is contextual. However, relocation then locates the safety in the child. So if we move you and fix you, we move you away, that has fixed the problem. The challenge with that is that the child is not exploitation. So you pick the child up and you move them somewhere else. The causes of that exploitation remain where you move that child from, and it creates a victim vacuum for other children to just slip right into unless the causes of the exploitation have been addressed. Maybe that relocation is necessary in some instances, but we can't assume that that is the end goal, particularly because of the internet and the fact that you can place a child anywhere, they can still be contacted. So we need to think far beyond physical movement to keep a child safe. So where we go to next, First thing is to really think through the one-to-one intervention model. Most children do talk about the importance of relational safety, sustained relationships with a practitioner that will hold them through a crisis. And one-to-one intervention excuse me, is critical for some young people to keep them safe when there's multi-agency professional network trying to deal with the experiences they're having. What we really need to do to advance that model is to think about the process that a child goes through on a one-to-one placement or a one-to-one referral, and what that might mean for the length of that intervention, and what that might mean for referrals when we're deciding that a one-to-one intervention is required. All too often, when we make a referral to a one-to-one intervention, and a number of education providers will do this, we will refer into a provision that's available for 6 months. 6 months will get you nowhere if the aim is to build a trusted relationship with a child to keep them safe through a process of recovery from an experience of exploitation. If you're talking about a child that's been exploited for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years before they've come to the attention of professionals, you're talking about sometimes weekly experiences of sexual violence and rape. That's not going to go away through a one-to-one session for an hour every week for 6 months. We know that that's not true. We also know that children will be at different levels in terms of engaging where they're at. One of the things to think about when they're in any of your services, even if they're generic educational provisions, is where on this journey is this young person that I have concern about? Because they may be referred into your service partway through a one-to-one intervention. And actually, there's other things that are going on for them. Now, most services say that when they receive a child for one-to-one intervention, the first thing they're concerned about is establishing a sense of safety for that child. Both external safety, so working with the partnership to ensure that those who are abusing that child cannot contact them, and the internal safety of that child, dealing with the trauma, mental trauma of what they've experienced, anything else that might be going on for them psychologically in terms of self-harm, in order to address that, get that sense of safety. Once that happens, a child may stabilise, and once they have stabilised, they may start making a disclosure. They may never make a disclosure, ever, and that's absolutely fine. They don't have to make a disclosure to be entitled to a service, and a number of organisations that have worked with children for the longest time will say we don't need them to make a disclosure for us to be able to support them. If they do make a disclosure, it may trigger a young person to go right back to being unsafe again, and then they have to start this whole process again, so it's far from linear. What services will say is once a child's safe and once they're stable, and they may or may not make a disclosure, we can then do some relational engagement work with them, which is the healthy relationships piece. Now, all too often when we refer into one-to-one or group provision, we refer directly into work to do healthy relationships. So, this child's being exploited, what we need is some healthy relationships work. Well, they cannot engage with that if they're not safe, and they cannot engage with that if they're not stable. I have interviewed, I don't know how many young women in custody now, who could recount to me exactly what a healthy relationship is. They've had so many healthy relationships programs, they could probably write the syllabus themselves, okay? They understand it. They can't experience one because they're not safe or they're not stable. Just being able to tell me what something is doesn't mean you can realise it for yourself. And quickly pushing a child into this before they're in a position to actually build that safe relationship with a worker, for example, or a sibling or a peer, means that you're just wasting resource. And you're just really pitching something far too soon. Right below the relational engagement is then the positive enhancement, which is the education, employment and training, which also we see as the first resort. Oh, you've been gang affiliated for 10 years, you've been exposed to all sorts of physical violence, you've been stabbed 3 times, what you need is a job. Fine, but actually, if I can't hold down a relationship with anybody, employer, work colleague, family member, friend, I'm going to really struggle to hold down this job. And I'm not going to be able to build those relationships if I don't feel stable or I don't feel safe. So it's not that these two things aren't important and aren't part of the one-to-one process. It's just critical to think, is this young person I'm referring into a service at that stage, or do they need a referral that is going to enable them to gain a sense of safety or to stabilise first? And make sure that money is well spent. And if you're doing that, you're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 years. sometimes of support for a young person if that's what they need to get them through that process. And family, when we're thinking about the risk, we don't challenge ourselves to think, well, actually, what we're dealing with here is a risky peer group. What we're dealing with here is a risky bus station. How are we going to engage with that if all we're talking about is the risky behaviour of that particular child and how we're going to manage that risky behaviour? So they're promiscuous, very much about this child's own behaviour rather than what's been done to that child. They are manipulative. Often hear that in multi-agency meetings where two professionals have been told different accounts of the same thing, or they like to play us off one another. They're very manipulative. A lot of that is survival behaviour, testing boundaries and relationships, not being able to trust people because you've been let down so often. You could use all those phrases to describe the same child that we describe as manipulative, one of which means we're putting the responsibility on that child to just fix up and stop lying. The other is actually we need to think about how we're going to support this child because clearly they're struggling to form a stable relationship with many of us if they're actually still testing us yet. Very streetwise young person, don't even know what that means they're on the street a lot, then they're probably vulnerable. Might be easier to just say they're on the street a lot, so we've got a lot of concern about them. If we think for a moment that a young person is safe and fine on the street at 11:30 at night, then they're very vulnerable young people. That's all that they are. To describe them as streetwise when they're 13 years old doesn't help anybody at all. As I said, they're making very risky choices. One of the riskiest choices I've ever seen in a case was a child that went to school. That was her risky choice, because she was being sexually bullied in school. The safe choice would have been to truant and then maybe tell someone if she was trying to really manage her risk. But what we saw with her truancy was people pushing her back into school because that was the protective thing and there was an assumption that her behaviour was what was risky. Okay, so really getting underneath, what do we mean by they're making lots of risky choices? What is it about the choice that's risky? And how do we work together with that young person to address that behaviour? Same with they're demonstrating a lot of risky behaviours. What is it about the behaviour that is risky? Going to the park where people are grooming children is risky, but going to the park is not risky. Going to the park should be fine, it's a park. So if you're being groomed at the park, then dealing with the risk would be dealing with the people who are grooming that child, pushing the multi-agency partnership to proactively get into the park so that the children can spend time there rather than curfewing the children or putting dispersal orders on them so they can't go there, which is generally where we go when we try to manage their risky behaviour. They're an absconder. They're missing a lot. We don't know where they are a lot of the time, so we're very concerned about their welfare. They're very sexually aware, very sexually experienced. Once again, I really don't know what that means. I've heard a 12-year-old be described as sexually aware before. They're very aggressive. You know, I can tell a good joke. It doesn't make me a comedian. If a child picks up a chair and throws it one day, it doesn't make them aggressive. It means they've picked up a chair and they've thrown it, and we need to get our head around why they've done that. The moment we start to take a particular type of behaviour or set of behaviours and then use a word to describe a whole child by that behaviour, we just absent our own professional responsibility, which we can't deal with this child because they're very aggressive. And I'm letting you know in advance, which is why I'm putting it on the notes, so that when you get the referral and they come in through your front door, you're automatically expecting this hooligan to come rushing through because they're very aggressive. And don't get me wrong, I've used the word. This is the thing, we all can slip into this, but the impact that has on how we engage with children and how we engage with one another should not be underestimated. They're out of control, completely out of control. Often that means they're out of our control, very often in the control of someone else. The person who's groomed them into street robbery, the person who's groomed them into sexual exploitation, the peer who's threatening to post a video of them online, and so on and so forth. Which means we can't get a hold of them because actually any sanction that we are suggesting, whether it's fining their parents for them not turning up in school or securing them in custody, is not worse than what that person has said they're going to do to them or their family if they don't show up and do this, that or the other. So the idea that they're completely out of anyone's control is often completely false. They're just not in the control of those who we wish them to be. They're a liar, often used to describe children who say different things at different times. If you have experienced multiple occasions where you have been physically violated, sexually violated, and then you're asked 12 months down the line, can you give me a clear account of all these things that happened on different days? I can't tell you what I ate for breakfast last week. I think I had pita breads, but I know there's one day in which I definitely had a yogurt, and I might think it was Thursday, and then next week it might be Wednesday. And that's minor. It's not something I've tried to suppress. It's not something that I've tried to forget about, and it's not something that has routinely happened to me in a way that I just can't deal with. So if it's something that's actually quite traumatic, I might say different things at different times. I might not feel ready to say everything. It doesn't mean I'm a liar. I read a case where one child was called a liar because one day she said that this group of boys had stolen her Oyster card and told her to come and collect it, and then they assaulted her, and then another day she said it was her phone that had been stolen. You know, maybe she got it wrong one time, maybe she got it wrong another time, maybe it happened, both things happened, but on different days. It's very difficult to know. I don't know if it was a sexual assault or just boys being boys. Very gendered language that we hear coming out sometimes in professionals' meetings. They're attracted to the glamour of this situation. There's nothing glamorous about being exploited or abused. Sometimes glamour is used to groom a child. The idea of glamour is used to lure them in. If we as professionals then repeat the language of the groomer, that is not a helpful situation. Really getting underneath what we mean by that word is very important, particularly for young people who are gang affiliated, which is often where I hear it used most. And this one, which is the one that seems least offensive, I guess, is the one I've used most, probably the one I hear most. They will not engage with us. The issue with this statement is that once again it is all about what that child will or won't do. It would be more helpful to say, we cannot engage them in this. We have been unable to engage them, because that's about us, the professionals, the people with a duty to safeguard. What do we need to do differently so that they are able to engage with us? How can we work with this situation so that they're able to engage with us? If all we say is we've tried and they won't engage, then you just shut the door on that child, because actually you've tried, they've turned you down, that's it. If you've tried something, it's not worked, and you need to think of something else, it leaves the door open for you to think with colleagues about who is best to engage. And the one I hear most about this, for example, is CAMS provision. Oh, they've had 3 referrals to CAMS, they've not shown up for their 2 p.m. appointment, they've not engaged. Is anyone surprised? No, not very surprised. CAMS is unable to engage them, which is why in some boroughs like Camden, we see mental health provision being offered in a detached format, with mental health workers on the street directly engaging with young people as an alternative, rather than just simply continuing to refer into a service that we know will not engage that child. So just thinking a bit more about how we're describing the young person that we're making a referral for, that we're being discussed at a multi-agency meeting, who sat in front of us, can completely shift whether or not we see this as an individual child's problem or whether we see this as a contextual problem that we need to address at multiple levels. Coming back to the relocation point, you know, I'm definitely not at a place where I think relocation should never happen. I've witnessed the desperation of professionals who know if they don't remove a child or place them insecure, that they have concerns that that child will not return, and they don't know what's going to happen, and that child just repeatedly goes missing. Now, in these cases, I can understand the need for relocation. What's important is that we think about the purpose of relocation and non-relocation as seeking safety at a multi-dimensional level rather than just physical safety. Often relocation is just about physical safety. They're physically unsafe here, so if we move them to local authorities away, they'll be safe because they won't be physically near the people who are harming them. And there's some merit in that approach. But what we also have to think is, in moving them to a different school, Are we undermining the relational safety that that child has with their peers, if they've got a safe network of peers, with that professional who works with them in this borough but isn't contracted to work with them in that local authority? Or are we taking them out of a safe home and placing them in care because where that home is located we have concerns? Or parents can't control their child anymore because of what's happening outside of the home, so we're going to place them into care here. But what we're doing is we're undermining all the safe relationships that child has. When we place them in a new school, they don't know anybody. We place them in a new area where they don't know anybody. They're at their most vulnerable point. Most vulnerable point for exploitation. That's the thing you really want if you're going to exploit a child. That child to have absolutely no one, because then you come in and you fill that gap. So if movement is essential for physical safety, then we also have to think, what do we put in place to ensure the relational safety? If I'm receiving a child into my educational establishment from another one because of what's happened to them in that educational establishment, how am I going to ensure that they experience some relational safety that's going to hold them through this very critical point in their life? Or are they just meant to navigate it on their own? And in keeping with that, how do I address the psychological impact of a relocation, which can often message to a child that this is your fault, which is why we're moving you and disrupting you, and not the people who actually abused you, we're just going to move you. And I've read notes in case files where children have challenged the professional decision. Why am I being moved? I've not done anything wrong. This person's done this to me, and instead of doing something to them, you're moving me. Why are you moving me? Now still, we might not be in a position to deal with those that are harming them, so we need to move them, but how do we explain that in a way that doesn't undermine the psychological safety of that young person, that communicates to them that they were the problem and that's why they were the one that was intervened with at the point of crisis? The cultural environment in a school in particular can create space for young people to foster that relational safety and safe friendships that will protect them and safeguard them against peer-on-peer abuse and other forms of exploitation. In one local authority we worked in, the Fair Access Panel adapted its placement forms to generate more information on the nature of the school context that the child was being removed from, and having more decision and discussion around the context that the child was being placed into, rather than just a general discussion about placement. The whole process actually identified particular trends in relation to peer-on-peer abuse that were happening in particular schools, and led to the local authority generating intervention for those schools around peer-on-peer abuse, rather than keep moving children out of them on a periodic basis when they became the next one to experience some form of violence and abuse. And that was a really critical process for that school, for that partnership of schools at that Fair Access Panel, to think more about the context that they were moving a child from, and not just this is the behaviour and this is why we need to move them, but in what context does that behaviour manifest, and is it likely to accelerate or decelerate where we're placing them. And that's particularly important for young women who've been sexually exploited, so their behaviour skyrocketed in mainstream, and then they're going to be placed in the pupil referral unit, and there's only 2 other girls in the pupil referral unit, both of whom are already being sexually exploited. So what do we think is going to happen when we place them there, unless there's a clear plan around that, or we place them somewhere else? And to enable this type of discussion to happen, real engagement within mainstream educational settings as well, to ensure that situations don't escalate to the point at which an exclusion is occurring for a child who's being victimised and whose problematic behaviour is the outpouring of victimisation. One of the critical things about that work in mainstream schools is to ensure that all staff are trained to receive referrals. It might sound a really obvious point, but all too often it's, you need to speak to this person, this safeguarding lead or this learning mentor on a Thursday, because they're the ones that have had the training on this particular issue. Rather than, if you want to tell the science teacher, you can. And in one case I reviewed, a young woman did choose to disclose to her science teacher after 23 months of not telling anybody that she'd been sexually assaulted in school, because that was the person that she trusted, and that was the person who pursued her when she was crying and was trying to just say, oh, it didn't matter, it didn't matter. If she'd been told, you need to go and speak to this person, this is the person you need to talk to, she may never have made her disclosure. And in schools that have very large student numbers, that is really important, that they can identify the relationship that's comfortable to them and they can make that disclosure. Thinking about peer group mapping is also really important, and most agencies struggle to peer group map because they work with individuals only, so social workers, youth offending team workers. They take individual referrals. They only know as much about that young person's peer network as that young person's willing to disclose. What's been really important is that social workers and youth offending team workers in some authorities where we work in have been meeting together because surprisingly their young people know one another. So they started to meet to map the network of young people that they know one another, and then that gives them much better indication of who's the leader, who's the follower, who's standing by in this peer group. If you do that intervention with that young person, it will have an impact on my young person like this, and so on and so forth. Schools and other educational providers play a critical role in this because they're the environments where you see young people in their friendship groups. You see how they socially interact. You know if they're socially isolated, if they tend to follow the crowd, if they tend to lead them, can provide really critical input into multi-agency assessments and highlight when a young person alone is being discussed, to give that peer context to the discussion, because there's very few professionals that are in a place to do that at all, or see a young person with their peers so can provide information in that regard. This is one peer network that featured in a case I reviewed. The image was drawn from the case review. It wasn't part of the intervention. The problem with this was that all of the intervention was designed around that 11-year-old in the middle. No one else was part of the plan, because she was repeatedly going missing. She had disclosed sexual assault in the park and at school, as there was all this one-to-one referral for her. We need to put a mentor in. Then she was excluded and moved somewhere else. And all the while, all these people around her, there was no intervention for her. Then she was placed on a Section 20 on child protection, moved out of her family home into another area. All these peer groups still continuing in the same way. That's generally how we work this issue. The child is the focus of the intervention, and the network around them receives little time or consideration unless people highlight that that child is not an island, and neither is their family, and there is a network of young people that often sit around them. I won't dwell on this slide too much, because you will get these sent round to you, but simply to say that we are slowly moving from reactive investigation, which relies on disclosure, to proactive investigation, which means you look for the signs and you investigate before a child needs to make a disclosure, and sometimes then a child never needs to make a disclosure. For example, in some local authorities where children have gone missing to hotels and have been found in hotels with adult men, the bedding has been seized and tested, and that has been used to prosecute those men without the child having to make a disclosure. But that requires training for hoteliers, that requires parents to send information about the registration plate of the car that their child went into and refused to stay at home. That requires multi-agency partnership working to actually look for the signs and pursue a conviction, and the role of people who are in the community, detached youth workers, shop owners, park wardens, housing caretakers, and so on and so forth, all sharing information. And thinking about this as safeguarding, not just enforcement and disruption. Often we see it as a policing issue, when actually disrupting abuse is a safeguarding issue as much as an enforcement one. And we've seen that in one local authority where there has been a new meeting process introduced for young people who are subject to a no further action accusation in relation to sexual assault, which is the bulk of the young people that we tend to see referred for this. They won't be charged, and then everyone's just sitting on the knowledge that they think a sexual assault took place, but they don't really know what to do about it. So getting everybody together and trying to disrupt what's going on, whether it's in the park or at the bus terminus, working with detached youth workers and so forth, to try and keep young people safe is really critical. What we want to try to do is move towards, remember those circles I showed you at the very start with all the issues? Move from those issues to having a clear response to these issues. If you can deal with grooming, consent, young people having a sense of identity and belonging, addressing issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, working with young people's sense of agency and sense of self and choice, and recognising that the issue is social and contextual, you will be able to deal with youth violence, sexual exploitation, teenage relationship abuse, children going missing, because all of those factors sit underneath all of them. They play out in different ways, but often we struggle to deal with sexual exploitation or youth violence because we can't deal with the fact that children are making choices and their sense of agency, or we're not engaging properly with the grooming process, or we are misunderstanding consent. And if we could do those things, whatever the next flavour of the month was, I'm sure we'd feel better equipped to be able to address it. So I've left some slides at the end here for people to go away and think about. I'm happy to be contacted. These are just some things I thought were implications, particularly for educational environments to consider. The main one being, how do you ensure an educational setting is safe, from policies and procedures through to peer relationships, but also how do you engage in multi-agency partnerships to be one of those critical voices in that work. And finally, what are all your levers? Oops. And there are many of them. So if people are interested in that thinking, please do get in touch with me, or you can include it in a question to me now. I'm more than happy to speak to people after today, but I hope that's been a helpful introduction to some of the work that we do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sandy Davies from Education Links. You've highlighted a lot of the problems there and the things that go wrong, and put forward some of the things that could be done to overcome that, particularly about the behaviour of professionals. What's the balance between the bad and the good? How do you see it at the moment?
It's a really difficult question, to be honest. I audited 11 sites a few years ago and been working with them for 3 years now, and have recently taken on audits of a few more. And what I found in every single one was, in every site there was some good. There were individual professionals who were mapping peer groups, going out to the local park, challenging language and so on and so forth. Everywhere. I didn't find a site where I couldn't see those strengths. The challenge was that they weren't consistent, they weren't strategically owned, there wasn't the framework to push those up, which is what we've been trying to do in the sites we're working with. And I think that's where the challenge lies, is not that people don't get this. I mean, it doesn't matter how many training sessions I do, everyone's yes, yes, yes. And individual people are working like this already, but what we need are for strategic partners and managers to quality assure in relation to this, to have a strategic framework that enables people to work like this, and to have a legislative framework for people, to encourage people to work like this. So a lot of what I'm doing at the moment is work with the inspectorates to think about how they inspect. So if they're asking questions about context, that may trigger some thinking. Discussions with DfE about the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance, for example, whether that thinks more about the school environment and the culture of a school, so trying to create that legislative framework. But I think there are practitioners everywhere who are working like this and who want to work like this, which is why we've set up a practitioners network that will be launching in a couple of months, that any practitioner can join. It's fully funded, so it doesn't cost people to join it, to facilitate peer learning across the country of people who do want to work like this, to create that support on the ground while we try to do this legislative work at the top.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Sue Koulas from Lichfield in Staffordshire. What you've just said about the practitioners network is excellent. I feel that we're almost creating breeding grounds for what's going on, working in the environments I'm working, not by choice, but I work there by choice, but not all the vulnerable young people are sent to us. What are your suggestions as to how we prevent what's going on happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is the discussion about placement, which I think is a critical one, and think about why we place, what we hope to achieve through those placements, and engaging fair access panels and the like in those types of decision making processes, to be a bit more critical about the thought process. But in terms of holding the risk where you are, I mean, what I would say is I visited a project in Rio at the start of last year, which was based in the most violent favela in Rio. There had been in excess of 5,000 murders in that favela. and there was a project right in the middle of it that we had to be brought in. We had to have a car collect us from outside and bring us in because taxis wouldn't go inside. And in that project, there were girls and boys working together. I sat down, talked to them about homophobia, human rights, all sorts of issues. They said they felt safe in there. Now, they said once they stepped outside, they didn't feel safe at all. But that building and the workers within it had managed to create a sense of safety for those young people to be able to critically engage in some discussions that I've struggled to have with other young people that I've met in other parts of the world and in the UK. And a lot of it was about thinking, what is the cultural climate of this space? What are the values? How do we own them? And yes, there will be incidents that disrupt that. More so where you have clusterings of very vulnerable young people, which they did have. But I think being honest and open about that with the workforce in that space, with the partnership, with the young people, and working through that, I think if I've seen it there, I have high hopes that it can happen anywhere, is what I'm trying to say. But that's notwithstanding the challenges that are often presented. And one of the things is ownership of that, and the second is, I guess, proactive thinking and learning around it.
Mary Swindale from Fleet Tutors. Do you have any direct examples of where local authorities have moved kids out or a child out of the area and where they felt a sense of safety with one person employed by that local authority, but that local authority has worked in genuine non-logo partnership with another authority and allowed that person to continue working with the young person?
Yes, I have. In short, I have one London borough, but actually it wasn't the local authority, it wasn't. There was a voluntary sector agency that was commissioned by a funder, charitable trust type funder, funded to work in a set number of local authorities with young people. When their young person was moved to another local authority, they made an agreement with their funders that they could continue to work with that child, even though the child had been placed in an authority where they didn't have any funding to work, and they were continued to fund by the charitable trust. I haven't seen examples where it's local authority funded, no. There may be them, but I haven't seen them. But I would say that that was important in ensuring the relational safety of that child in the placement move, and it was a successful move for that child.
Thank you very much, Carlene. There's some incredibly exciting opportunities to take back to schools for discussion and real action points there from both Suzanne and Carlene. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to both of them for those really inspiring keynotes this morning. So thank you both ladies for your contributions.